The future of energy is very exciting and couldn't be more important. In the last video, we saw how energy is both the cause and solution of some of our greatest challenges, and why upgrading it is so difficult. But new energy technologies are moving quickly. Nuclear fusion startups are emerging faster than ever. Numerous small modular reactors are close to deployment, and renewable energy is setting record after record. Yet despite our progress, our problems are growing faster than ever, and we're running out of time. If we want to turn things around, we need to make big changes. But how do we decide what technologies we should focus on? How big could the impact for these technologies be? What performance will these technologies need to escape the global energy trap? In the last video, we appeared to be caught in an energy trap and identified that we need to develop promising technologies that are both clean and cheap to escape. Should we be investing in thorium or geothermal? Perhaps both. Do we split the funding 50-50, or should we invest in the most promising one? But wait, how do we decide which ones are the most promising? The most viable ones can't be decided from a list of positives and negatives alone. Not all of the topics we come across should be our top priority, and there are many important issues that often go overlooked. When it comes to energy, there are many performance parameters to consider: production density, capital investment, reliability, and of course, cost. We will look at a range of technologies over the next few videos to determine their potential and when they could be deployed. As the series progresses, it will become increasingly apparent that no single technology will help us escape. If we want to determine which technologies actually have the greatest potential, then we need to understand where the biggest problems lie. Electricity is a topic that gets a lot of attention, and it certainly is important, accounting for nearly 30% of global energy consumption. However, given that a third of electricity generation already comes from clean sources, how much does electricity actually contribute to carbon emissions? Well, actually, quite a lot. Electricity generation from fossil fuels is just 18% of our energy consumption. Yet it makes up nearly 40% of global carbon. But why is electricity responsible for such high emissions? This is something we'll come back to later, but part of the reason will become clearer when we look at what type of fuels are used to produce electricity. Nearly 40% of electricity is generated by coal, which emits the most carbon dioxide per unit of heat. Our primary choice of fuel is the least efficient, and as we saw in the last video, the most dangerous too. If we want to have a big impact from both a climate and health perspective, then replacing coal plants with more efficient and ideally clean sources should be a top priority. Coal plants used to be popular because they were cheap to build and run. However, it's becoming increasingly uncompetitive with the tightening of environmental regulations and the falling cost of renewable and natural gas plants. While it appears that phasing out coal is already well underway, declining in the Americas and largely disappearing in Oceania and Europe, however, coal capacity is actually increasing globally, with a significant rise in Asia, notably India, and especially China. This growth is surprising, since India and China's plants are running at just half their capacity, and adding new coal plants will only make it worse. So while an increase in coal plants sounds concerning, unless there's a significant rise in energy consumption, much of this new capacity may never actually be utilised. This is supported by a decline in generation for 2019, despite a capacity increase. And this is likely to continue as cheaper alternatives drive them out of the market. Clean energy already accounts for over a third of electricity generation, but if we want to replace coal's 10 terawatt hours per year, then we'll need to double our current clean generation. Nuclear accounts for 2.8 terawatt hours annually, and that capacity has remained largely constant for the last 2 decades, though the lack of growth is partly due to a wave of decommissioning in the years following Fukushima Daiichi's partial meltdown. In the years after the incident, we can see that nuclear is growing at around 1.7% per year. That said, scaling up our current nuclear infrastructure is difficult. Construction speed is slowing down, with new plants approaching 10 years to build, and over the last decade, the cost of nuclear has increased 23%. As a result, building more of our current generation of plants doesn't look like an effective way to replace coal. However, as part of this series, we'll investigate promising nuclear technologies such as small modular reactors, thorium, and fusion. Though for now, we'll assume nuclear generation to remain largely the same over the next decade. Hydropower produces 4.2 terawatt hours annually, making it the largest renewable source. Though it's sometimes excluded from the renewables category due to questions about its sustainability. For simplicity, for this series, we'll consider hydroelectric its own category, and it'll have its own video. While hydropower is growing at around 3% annually, depending on the size of the project, construction of hydro plants takes between 3 to 10 years. It requires a lot of initial capital, making it difficult to scale infrastructure quickly. With nuclear growing slowly and hydro growing modestly, how well positioned are renewables for replacing coal? Renewables account for 2.8 terawatt hours annually and have grown at an average of 14% since the year 2000. This rate represents a doubling of generation every 5 years. If we combine the growth rates of all clean technologies, we can see it would take a decade to replace the 10 terawatt hours of coal, with renewables providing the bulk of the increases, though energy demand is expected to increase 19% by 2030, which will be covered by natural gas plants in this scenario. However, a closer look at renewable growth reveals even greater potential. Solar and wind energy have seen considerable yearly growth for the last 2 decades, going from a tiny fraction of renewables to the majority of their electricity generation. If we project the growth of solar and wind independently, we see that renewable electricity is set to scale considerably and would halve the time we need to replace current coal generation. The explosion in renewables is the result of a cost reduction in wind power over the last decade of 29% and 39% for offshore and onshore, respectively. And over the same time frame, solar has fallen by an astonishing 82%. Still, is it reasonable to expect renewable costs to continue to plummet? Or will we run up against limits? How does location, grid integration, and storage affect scaling opportunities? Can we really assume renewables will be able to replace the full 10 terawatt hours of coal? These technologies will have their own videos exploring just that. Still, the impressive growth of renewables shows us just how important cost reductions are for fast scaling. As such, we'll use it as an indicator for the future potential of all the technologies we'll look at. Calculating the costs of various energy technologies is complicated. Many factors need to be considered. From capital and life cycle to running costs and utilization, the aggregate lifetime spend and returns must be considered. The levelized cost of energy, or LCOE, is a measure that includes all these costs over a project's lifetime to give a standardized cost per kilowatt hour. By taking the global weighted average of energy projects, we can build a useful picture of the costs for specific technologies. LCOE is a simplified calculation that excludes details that can have a positive or negative impact on real-world project costs, such as subsidies or storage costs, respectively. Energy markets are subject to variation and projection inaccuracies, especially when applied at a global scale. While other factors must be considered, ELCO still provides a useful tool for comparison and will be the basis for cost targets in this series. While subsidies are very useful for accelerating renewables growth and adoption, a technology needs to become economically viable without subsidies to have long-term sustainability, since many countries will not be willing or able to finance expensive energy sources indefinitely. For this reason, we'll set a minimum threshold for where a technology can start to have an impact without subsidies, and a target threshold for where we can expect a technology to outcompete fossil fuels from a cost perspective. It's worth noting that while subsidies are sometimes associated with renewable projects, fossil fuels actually receive far more. For electricity, we will set the minimum threshold for a new technology at 18 cents per kilowatt hour, which is the 95th percentile for global fossil fuel costs, and we will set the target threshold at 5 cents per kilowatt hour, which is the 5th percentile. With the ELCO of many new technologies falling quickly, many have already crossed the minimum threshold, and some are crossing the target threshold too. Electricity may well be responsible for 40% of our carbon emissions, but as we'll see, those days may well be numbered. While electricity generation is a major contributor to global carbon, there's another source that doesn't get as much attention. It emits the same as power generation, but it's even harder to solve. The problem is heat. We're desperately reliant on thermal energy for many critical industries. Fossil fuels store a tremendous amount of chemical energy, which we convert into heat through combustion, releasing carbon dioxide in the process. While combustion always produces heat, the way we utilize it matters. Transport and power generation use the heat of combustion indirectly to drive engines and spin turbines. But what if producing heat is actually the direct goal? 90% of industrial and building heat comes from fossil fuels, making up half of energy consumption and 40% of carbon. The reason fossil fuels dominate heat generation is because they have an even larger cost advantage than we saw for electricity, and this makes replacing them especially difficult. We've seen there are clean electricity technologies that can compete on cost with fossil fuel. So why is heat generation different? While electricity is cheap, it's still far too expensive for producing heat. When it comes to founding steel, firing bricks, or even heating buildings, it's not cost effective, and that's a big problem. Fossil fuel plants heat water until it's a high pressure steam that spins a turbine generator. This approach leads to large inefficiencies, as much of the thermal energy is lost in the process, giving them a range of efficiencies of around just 20 to 60%. Despite this, they're still cost competitive with clean electricity. In other words, if we used electricity from clean or fossil fuel power plants, the cost would be similar. However, if we use fossil fuels to produce heat directly, the efficiency loss almost disappears, reducing their cost dramatically to levels clean electricity can't compete with. While fossil fuels dominate heat generation, there are alternatives. Biofuel, nuclear, and geothermal contribute around 7% of heat generation, though cost and availability have limited their scale. There are also promising technologies that increase the efficiency of heat consumption. However, without a significant breakthrough, we'll struggle to reduce heating's 40% contribution to global carbon. Levelized cost of heating, or LCOE, is a measure of the lifetime cost of heat. In this series, we'll consider a new technology's minimum threshold for heating cost to be 8 cents per kilowatt hour, and the target threshold to be 2.2 cents per kilowatt hour. Heat is an area where fossil fuels particularly excel, so meeting this target will not be easy. However, technology moves quickly, so how much cheaper can we make geothermal or biofuels? Can thermal solar reduce its costs like photovoltaics have? Can technologies such as small modular reactors provide cheap district heating? And let's not rule out heating with clean electricity just yet. If we want to use it for heating, then its cost will have to be 55% cheaper than it is now. Though as we've seen, solar PV has halved in cost every 4 years. So perhaps we aren't as far away from clean heat energy as we first thought. Now we appreciate the scale of the challenge and where the opportunities lie, it's time to put everything back into perspective. As we saw in the last video, fossil fuels help the world to develop rapidly, and their cheap energy is critical to the industries we need for our survival. We need cheap energy to tackle some of the world's largest problems, and fossil fuels have been integral, but it's not been without cost. Geopolitical, environmental, and health are just a number of major problems resulting from our critical reliance on fossil fuels. This video has focused on the largest challenge preventing us from escaping our energy trap: fossil fuels' spiralling carbon emissions. In light of that, how would a clean revolution in energy affect our GHG footprints? The topics we've covered make up half of our annual emissions, but cheap and clean energy could take us further than that. If it's combined with the electrification of transport, we could be looking at a future where our fossil fuel usage dwindles. It will also enable technologies such as vertical farming to reduce the remaining emissions from sources such as agriculture and deforestation. But this all focuses on reduction and damage limitation. Cheap, clean energy has the potential to directly reverse our climate impact by enabling carbon removal technologies. If that's not enough, it will also help us tackle the other challenges that make up the global energy trap, such as food security, water security, and poverty. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a step back. How far can the trends of renewable energy actually go? What other factors beyond cost determine a technology's potential? How much of transport can actually be electrified? These are some of the questions this series aims to address. The answers are complex, but we can't understand the future of energy without them. The next videos will look at specific technologies in detail and their ability to meet our electricity and heat demand, starting with solar. As we've seen, with low costs and rapid growth, solar shows significant potential for creating a future of cheap and clean energy. But despite its promise, many questions remain regarding drawbacks that could greatly limit its future scaling. So, what are the problems with solar? Will we be able to overcome them? How big of a role will solar have in the future of energy? Let's find out.